This is Diagnosing and Preventing Embroidery Digitizing Disasters. My name is Erich Campbell, and that is important only in one thing, that I spent more than 20 years, a bit more than 20 years in this industry, and a lot of it as an in-house digitizer, working directly with production and as an outsourced digitizer. So I have probably made more mistakes than any of you have yet, and trust me, I've had to deal with a lot of disasters. The thing is, from a digitizer's point of view, we can really talk about what's going on and breaking down in these things, and I'll really kind of approach things from that. So you're gonna hear a bit about digitizing. You don't digitize for yourself. What I always tell people is, yes, there's a lot of numbers and me talking about dragging things around on screen. If you don't do any of that, this still will help you talk to the person who does and ask them for what you need. So listening to that is still worthwhile, even if you don't digitize yourself. And I always recommend people get digitizing software and learn to do minor editing for the times where you can't get somebody back in town to help with you, but you do need a quick fix immediately while you're trying to get things run. So this is the wall of fame or the wall of shame. What I'm gonna say is this is what my operators like to do. They stapled every sample we put up that they liked or didn't like on the walls, and this is one of several walls that were in our production department, the last place I worked. So trust me, if you have to look at your mistakes and your heroic efforts every single day, you start to learn a little bit about what samples are supposed to look like and what they're not. But this is partially for me to say, which I'm gonna repeat repeatedly throughout this thing. Multi-million-dollar company, we sampled every single thing. If you tell me you don't have time to sample your new designs, you're wrong. You need to build the time in. Sampling is key to making sure things get right and things get done. And I have 16,000 plus designs under my belt to tell you the truth about that. So let's start with the common threads. These are the things that are gonna run through the entire talk that we're gonna have today, things that we should just kind of keep in mind. Number one, embroidery requires a holistic approach. Yes, I'm going to talk a lot about digitizing today, but if you are not great with your supplies, if you're not using the right stabilizers, if you don't know how to run your machine, if your machine is in poor repair, or you don't know how to make that interaction happen, so you're using stabilizers, fabrics with the right files, any one of those legs on that three-legged stool, the file's bad, you're not doing the right execution, your machinery is in bad condition, will cause this thing to go wrong. And you can adjust certain things in one of those fields for something else going wrong on the other side. So honestly, it's a holistic approach, and all of this has to be made clear that you understand each part of this as we go forward. And the other thing is, there's more than one way to get the job done. If you have a favorite person who taught you something that's working for you, just because I tell you something else doesn't mean either of us are wrong. It's entirely possible. I always go, but I saw a YouTube video that tells me. I'm like, cool, did that work? Awesome, who is that YouTube video? I don't have a problem with that, and anybody else shouldn't have a problem with it either. Honestly, there's not only more than one way to get the job done, but often there are more than one approach. There's all digitizing approaches that could be fixed with stabilizer changes. There are stabilizer things that are wrong that could be fixed with digitizing. You can go back and forth because you're really just trying to maintain and deal with the distortion that's natural to embroidery. So let's get into this. The other thing is understanding the elements, and you're going to understand embroidery. What I mean by that is, if we start to understand distortion, pull distortion, push distortion, what stabilizer is supposed to be doing, how fabrics interact with the needle and the thread, we'll be able to understand everything. There's only one stitch an embroidery machine makes. It's one stitch on the surface of the material from point to point. Everything else is combinations of those stitches. If we know how those stitches work with each other, we will understand everything about embroidery on the larger scale. And of course, as a digitizer, I'm going to say it now, digitizers are going to make mistakes. And there's two types of digitizers, the ones who make mistakes and the ones who lie to you about it. Very obviously, there's going to be problems with your files sometimes. I'm not the one who's going to tell you that it's always on the machine, but at the same time, it's not always the digitizer either. The thing to realize, though, is if you are starting to digitize or edit for yourself, that includes you, that includes me. I still make mistakes sometimes, and what it really is usually making an incorrect guess about what's going on with the materials or something in the design. But honestly, over time, with practice, with watching the machines, with watching that interaction, it's always going to get better. So this is what we're going to do today. Isolate, identify, intervene, and improve. First, we're going to talk about isolating issues, how we figure out where the issue is coming from, if it's a machine issue, if it's a digitizing issue. Identification, intervention, talking about some of the common issues that happen with designs and how we can change things to fix those issues. And third, improving your process of sampling. I think part of the problems people have is really that they're not sampling or testing in a way that's very scientific. They're throwing things at the wall to see if it'll work. Sometimes it works, sometimes they're doing way more than they need to, and sometimes they're not doing the right thing at all. And the last thing, though I may have to do it in the hallway since I talk too much, ask me questions. The best that you can get out of this value is talking to your neighbors and talking to me directly. Ask a question if you don't get something that you like out of this session. We'll do that at the end, but I'm happy to answer questions as long as I can stay. So first, Isolating issues, digitizing versus execution. And for me, when I say execution, I just mean everything that happens once the file is done, once we get onto the machines. So first thing about this is, if we're trying to figure out if an issue is digitizing or not, digitizing issues are predictable. It's not going to be variable from run to run or from head to head the same way that you might have something that's material, like thread problems. Digitizing issues should be fairly predictable in that if something's present in the digitized file, this should happen at near or the same time or place on every run. Settings are not changing in the file from run to run. So if you run it and it runs great 5 times, runs poorly the 6th, the file is probably not your issue. Certainly we can be very close to the edge of something being running correctly, and digitizing might fix that. And we'll talk about some of those issues later. But most of the time, especially with thread breaks, this is a very predictable thing. It's something that I like to talk about very directly because that's one of the ones where it's very easy to see when digitizing is causing thread breaks. Thread breaks that occur in the same portion of the design reliably can be caused by excessive densities, so stitches being too close together, overly short stitches. Somebody for some reason has had a setting incorrectly and they're dropping multiple sub-millimeter stitches. With 40 weight thread, that 7511 needle will break a previous stitch and it'll break the thread. Or overly packed detail. Where are you going to see this? If you've ever done characters in the eyes and the face, human beings tend to really focus on faces, and the digitizers get stuck on trying to put too much detail in faces. So eyes and faces are always sticking up. You have that little knob that's sticking there. There's knots in the face because they're trying to put too much detail in. And you'll see packed detail breaking things. The one thing that can be different here, you got to watch for problematic garment structures. If we're seeing this on a structured hat right over the middle of the seam, that might be different. If every time you start the machine we break thread or break a needle right in the dead center of a cap, it might not be the file itself so much as the positioning right in the center of that seam. Also remember, whenever we have a cap, a constructed cap, and we fold those two ends together and put tape over them, you have 8 layers of material that you're stitching through right at those edges. So sometimes we can do something about it with digitizing, like starting off of the seam, but that can be something where it's at the same place all the time, but it's not digitizing, it's more about the garment structure causing the issue. Same thing with seams and pockets. If you're getting too close to a seam or you're doing over a seam on like a jacket back, the seams can cause issues with abrasion and thread breakage. So when we're isolating these issues, other thing to think about digitizing, you're primarily going to have issues that affect stitch placement, coverage, and shape. What I mean by that, outlines are not right as long as your stabilization's good, and we know that. Your outlines are off. If we have coverage issues, your fills don't look dense enough. We're seeing sawtoothing at the edges of our satin stitches. Sometimes there's other things that can cause that, like coarse materials, but that's more of a digitizing thing. And shape. If you see shapes that are distorted, that's something we can definitely counteract with digitizing when we understand what distortion does on the machine. So those are the kind of issues we have. Wherever, the thing is, people, these failures matter. Knowing what type of failure that you're seeing matters a lot. I constantly had people when I was digitizing telling me they're getting loops on their machine and tell me, you digitized wrong, there's loops. I can't control the tension of the machine through a file. A DST file, especially these old school files, only contain coordinates and commands. I can say where the needle's supposed to be and if it's going to be up or down. That's it. And then I have a command to say change to a new color. And it's really a stop. It doesn't even do much more than that. So honestly, I would love to be able to control tension that finally. We don't. We don't have any chance for that. Unless we have incredibly packed detail, and sometimes you'll see some looping because we're going through too much material. Things like looping, especially when you have an occasional looping in a fill, digitizing is not the problem there. This is something that's going on the machine. Now, if you have stitches where they aren't supposed to be or they're not lining up, it might be digitizing. We can have problems with stabilization, we can have problems with hooping that also cause this issue, but digitizing can help us adjust for travel and distortion throughout our design. So, the other thing about isolating these issues, and this is where I do get to kind of complain back as a digitizer and say sometimes it's not my fault, because digitizing depends on the environment. What do I mean by this? The environment of the design is where it lives, the kind of garment it's on, how it's being stitched, what hoop it's in, what stabilizer we're using. So digitizing is not universal. As much as we would love every file to be universal and work exactly the same, especially when we start going into fine details, small straight stitch outlines on different parts of the design, we can have things that have a very little margin of error. And if we change our fabrics a lot, we can get different results. Though there may be a middle ground of settings that stock design digitizers use, there is no universal amount of push or pull. And if you don't know push or pull distortion, trust me, I'm going to get there with you. There is no one type of underlay that works for every situation, and there's no one singular setting of density that will make everything have the proper coverage. So one file is never going to work on all materials the same. And so we need to prepare and isolate ourselves so that we don't have this erroneous info. So isolation preparation, we're going to talk about how we don't think about this thing the wrong way, how we go about finding out a more scientific way of testing this stuff, right? And so the first thing we want to do is control our environment. When I talk about sampling, the first thing I'm going to tell you is I don't mean get 2 layers of cutaway backing and stitch your design. The first time somebody walks in with a shirt made of 2 layers of cutaway backing, I'll let you off the hook. Truth of the matter is, the best way to sample, especially if you're having trouble with a design or something, or you're learning to digitize, is on materials that match the structure, stretch, and the relative color contrast. Doesn't mean you have to always buy an extra garment of what you're working on, but if there's a new garment that comes out that you know you're going to be selling over and over again, yeah, buy an extra and run stuff yourself. The things that you want to run are what's going to be present in the final embroidery, the hoops, tensions, and settings that you're going to have in production. A lot of my operators, when I was digitizing and not doing the operation anymore, they always like to baby one single head, run all their samples on it and make it look really great and run it slow, and it looked very clean, and they got it approved by the sales department, they got it approved by the customer, and then they would take it and put it on the dirtiest 12 head we had that didn't work and run it as fast as they could, and it looked terrible. You can't switch up all of these variables and expect to get the same results. And frankly, the materials matter a lot more than you think they do. The texture, the relative stretch, the color, and even the direction of the fabric's grain. One other thing that I'll see people do is they get on board with me and they're like, all right, Eric, I'm sampling on stuff and it still looks terrible. And all of my horizontal lines look like they're bleeding into the fabric. And then I look at it, they're sampling on jersey knit with the grain horizontal. T-shirts don't have the grain horizontal, they have the grain vertical. Though that also means if you have small vertical straight stitch lines in your design on a t-shirt, they will sink in between the ribs of the grain sometimes. So the direction and the garment and the fabric's grain. The other wonderful thing that my operators always used to do is on a PK polo shirt that has texture on the front, they'd sew it on the inside that had less texture to try and get me to pass something off. Trust me, the grain matters. So some of these things require specialty treatment, especially if you go from really thin materials to really lofty materials, something that's textured, you go onto toweling or a robe, you go onto a heavy sweatshirt. If you start out on a t-shirt and then go to a Carhartt hoodie, you are not going to have the same pull compensation settings between the two. It's lovely to think that the universal file exists, but it doesn't. So, like I said, stitch angles aligned with ribs or grain in the fabric, you can get show through. Vertical fills on t-shirt will do this a lot too. High pile fabrics need supportive underlay, not to sink in. So toweling, French terry, anything that's got a pile to the front of it is going to need some underlay to help it not sink. And stretchy and thick fabric, can you need more compensation? Meaning we know that things get narrower, stitches draw in and get thinner. You need more compensation on stretchy or thick materials. And also garment structure. We've all heard there's cap files and flat files. What does this mean? On a cap, to make things stable, because we have a lot of material that's not being held together, we need to make sure that we're running from the center out, and best if we can from the bottom up. Why? We're running from the most stable place that's attached to the cap frame, that's right next to the brim, and we're smoothing it out like a tablecloth. We run things out from the center and keep those ripples from building, because as we run in a design, in front of the presser foot, you will watch. If you watch designs run, material starts to build up at the front of that presser foot like a wave. If we center out like this, we have less chance of distortion, waves, ripples, and misregistration of outlines. And the next thing I would love to make sure people do, even if you're not digitizing, you need to have at least software that you can open up things in and watch it run. Review the preview. I like to call this my pre-flight. Pre-flight check before I throw this thing on a machine. Use your software's replay tool. It can be called replay, slow redraw. There'll be something like that involved that has a film strip view and a player. Evaluate designs before you run so you can find gross design errors. Here's where I tell on the digitizers again. Because there are things that we do. Unnecessary movement, they put something in the wrong order. Poor layering, something's on top of something that should be underneath it, or vice versa. The colors have somehow been out of order, or we have an element out of order, or anything that seems off, and keep notes. So you want to keep notes from it as you're running it to either refer to a digitizer, if you're digitizing yourself, to go back and figure out what's going on. So it's something like this. We're looking at this one, it has a stitch player is what we're calling it. Usually we'll have a little indicator here that we can scrub back and forth. And here's our little bar indicator. We can see I've scrubbed into this design. But we can scrub back and forth over problem areas to try and identify issues, because we can watch that design run a lot faster than we can on the machine. And the big one is this, copy and paste errors. Digitizers steal from themselves. If I have to make custom text and it has 3 E's in it, do you think that I digitize 3 E's? Absolutely not. But it does mean that a lot of the time, if I'm not careful, I will leave an accidental copy of that E, so you get one big thick letter that looks weird. That thick letter is because somebody left 2 copies on the first E. That's where a lot of digitizers do that. Scrubbing through it real quick means we don't have to ruin a garment in the process. So quickly run through your stuff, review the preview, and you'll be happier with these errors not being on your machine. And here's the one that everybody gets mad at me about. You need to watch your machines run, especially if you're learning to digitize, if you're running on a new project. This does not, when I say run samples, it doesn't mean turn sample on, go make coffee, walk out, hit some Netflix, do something else. I mean watch the design. And in fact, I can tell you exactly how I know about this, and here's the funny thing about it. My people always used to call this my last security system, aside from the fact that I am very bald under here. Why do I have the hat on all the time, aside from getting the Mexico sun off my head? Because when I used to sit down, I would get so intent watching my designs, I'd get really close, and then eventually the take-up lever would hit me in the head, and I'd stop and go, okay, back out of it. At the same time, watching things run absolutely teaches you how material is going to deform, how stitches form, how stitches interact with each other. You will see things either fall apart or come together in real time. And that experience will absolutely shape you as someone who embroiders or digitizes. You will know what to tell somebody when things are going wrong. And frankly, here's one of the other examples of that. I was testing a new system from Madeira that they use for making patches. It has these little plastic window frames. And I digitized something according to the instructions they gave me, not paying very close attention to the instructions. And there was a line of stitching going around here that really should have been 4 millimeters, and they had a decimal point moved, and it said 0.4, and I made that line of stitching 0.4 millimeters, completely just not thinking, so I was trying to get this test done for them. When this outline ran on this patch plastic, before the rest of this background like underlay came up, you can see right here where it's starting to separate. 5 seconds from me taking this picture, that plastic wads up into a knot and stops the machine. If I wasn't washing it, when I try and come back to that dead sample and figure out what happened, if I have a wad of mess on the machine and it stopped, it's beeping from the other room and I come back from my coffee break, I don't know why it happened. So when I was testing brand new materials, you sit and you watch them like a hawk, because this will tell you how they're gonna run, and you'll really appreciate that later on when you wanna do this over and over repeatedly for production. So yes, I do mean watch the machine. And one of the things that you can do to make this easy for yourself, if you've got a little bit of analog streak in you and you like to write things down, print a copy of the production and placement files. As you're running something, you're running your new patch, something's going on that's going wrong, you stop and circle the issue and then write something about that on the actual materials. Because usually these have stop codes behind them, you can say which stops are wrong, and you can just literally put X's on places so you can go back and look at them later. So if you have trouble remembering, because I'll say, I always think I'm gonna know what's going on, and then I go back and I run a jacket back like this, and do you think by the last color change of this jacket back, I remember what was going on in stitch 100? Not really. You think you do, but you don't. So honestly, taking notes helps. And like I said, the other thing I'll tell you, I started out as an operator on 6 needle Tajimas. I ran 2 12 heads that didn't have thread break sensors. I walked up and down watching them like a hawk. But let me tell you how much better my digitizing was. Watching designs run like that, watching for every little error.